Record. All right, we are ready to rock. Welcome to this webinar. This is the intersection of patriarchy and gender in human trafficking. And I wanted to introduce myself to get started. My name is Delana May, and I'm the Executive Director of Dark Bali. Dark Bali is an anti-trafficking organization that is working in Indonesia, and our vision is to see sex slavery abolished and the broken lives of survivors restored through creating awareness, empowering advocacy, and building partnerships for the prevention, rescue, and restoration of children throughout Indonesia. So lots of words, but what that basically means is we are a coalition of small grassroots organizations, and our role is really just to support these local organizations and what they do. So establishing task forces and just bringing lots of different kinds of training opportunities and things like that. So that's me and that's us. A couple of other housekeeping items before we get started. If you'll go ahead and make sure you know where the chat box is in Zoom. I don't mind being interrupted. So if we're going through this and something's confusing or you want me to say it a different way, feel free to just send me a chat in the chat box. That's totally fine. And if you have a question and you don't really feel like it fits anywhere, I am going to try to have a little bit of time right at the very end, so you can feel free to ask at that point as well. The last thing I want to say before we get started is simply this. This is a yucky topic. There is not a nice way to talk about kids and sex trafficking. And so just take care of yourself. If you're listening to this and at some point you're like, I just got to walk away. That's really okay. And it's really normal. This is going to be recorded and it'll go up on our website later this next week. And so if you even just decide you need to check out today and you're going to come back to it later, that's okay. Feel free to do that. Especially right now, we're all in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis and life is really stressful. We're all carrying a lot of anxiety. And so even if maybe normally this would be okay to deal with, maybe right now it's not, just because you're kind of in a state of anxiety. So just want to say, take care of yourself, and let's get started. So we have a few goals today. Our first goal is reviewing our definitions of human trafficking and what push and pull factors are. If you joined us for our webinar a few weeks back, we did a Human Trafficking 101. That's up on our website if you missed it. And we covered that in a lot of detail. We're going to cover it a little bit more briefly today, just because as we get into the meat of the conversation, I want to make sure everybody's really clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about human trafficking. And then I'd like you guys to be able to really be able to articulate the relationship between gender, human trafficking, patriarchy. We're going to look at some of the data and kind of what's come out over the years, and even some of the newer stuff that's coming out as it relates to gender specifically. And then we're going to be talking about girls, and we're going to be talking about boys, and kind of how human trafficking, sex trafficking in particular, is playing out in both of those demographics. So that is our goals for today. Again, feel free to interrupt me if you have a question. Just use the chat box for that. So let's get started on this. When we're talking about human trafficking, we want to make sure we all have the definition. Now, this is a big block definition. Don't even feel like you need to read it. The reason I put it in that format is just to make the point that it's kind of overwhelming. But the modern definition of human trafficking comes from the Palermo Protocol. The Palermo Protocol was created by the UN. So it's our modern definition. It's kind of the international definition of human trafficking that anti-trafficking organizations use. And the way the protocols work is each country, each nation has the option to ratify the Palermo Protocol as a whole, or to say, you know, we're going to take this but not that, or we're going to change it up in some way, or yeah, we're going to make up our own thing. And so it really depends country to country whether or not they've ratified this as a whole or not. So in most places, they've taken it and said, yep, that makes sense to us. We're going to take this Palermo Protocol and say that that's our definition as we write our own laws regarding the prosecution of trafficking. And there are some exceptions. Indonesia is an exception that hasn't ratified the Palermo Protocol as a whole, and I'll explain that in a minute. But when we look at this big definition, we can actually simplify it really easily by just breaking it down into its three parts. So if I have a situation or a case and I want to know, is this human trafficking or is this not human trafficking? All I really have to do is hold it up against this protocol in these three parts. So the first part of the Palermo Protocol is the act. The act is what is happening. And then you have the means. The means is how it's happening. And then you have the purpose, why it's happening. So to prove that trafficking has happened in this situation, I have to prove at least one act, at least one means, and at least one purpose. And so these are not ands, they're ors. So when we're talking about the acts, we're talking about the recruitment, the transportation, transfer, harboring, or the receipt of persons. And the reason that these are all different is that we want there to be accountability in each part of that. So in a human trafficking situation, it's pretty common that there are multiple people playing a part. There's multiple traffickers. And we want the person that's recruiting a victim to be just as liable and culpable and accountable as the person that is harboring that person at the end, or the person that's doing the transferring. And then for the means, or the how it's done, what's necessary is to prove that there's some sort of force, fraud, or coercion, essentially. So this is all about consent. Has this person consented to what's happening to them or not? And this is why we see a difference between, say, a sex worker and a sex trafficking victim. They're not the same thing. There is a difference in consent there. And obviously you can have an argument about people involved in sex work and how much choice do they really have. But for the purpose of a legal case, or when we're trying to allocate resources, we do differentiate between people that said, this is what I want, and people who have not had the right to say that. And then you have the purpose, exploitation. There's lots of kinds of exploitation. When we're talking about trafficking specifically, we're talking about the exploitation of labor acts, of types of slavery and servitude. So maybe somebody is a housekeeper or a nanny in somebody's home, but they don't have the right to leave. And then we're talking about sexual services and prostitution. And finally, the exploitation of the human body, which is the removal of somebody's vital organs, obviously against their consent. So again, we're talking about an act, a means, and a purpose in order to prove that human trafficking has happened. And this is true for anybody over the age of 18. And that's what that asterisk means there in the middle column, the means. For somebody under the age of 18, the Palermo Protocol recognizes that we don't need to prove the means. So for a child, we need to prove an act has happened, that there's been recruitment or transfer or receipt of person or the harboring of a child in order to exploit them for sex, for labor, or something like that. But we don't have to prove whether or not the kid said, yeah, I want this or not. And that's simply because we recognize that there are always adults involved in this with them. There's always an abuse of power. So even if you have a 14-year-old girl that's like, yeah, I want to be involved in prostitution, we recognize that she does not have the cognitive ability to understand the ramifications. We recognize that there are adults involved both in getting her to the point to be sold, and adults involved in raping her. So there's somebody buying her and purchasing her for sex. And as a society, we said, no, we're not going to recognize that she has that right to consent to sex work. And so for a child, for the Palermo Protocol's purposes, we prove one act, we prove one purpose, and that's trafficking. And that's where it gets a little fuzzy with some countries. So in Indonesia, that's not different. For a child, for an adult, they all have to prove acts, means, and purpose. So in Indonesia, we actually do have to legally prove that the 7-year-old did not consent to sex work, to call it trafficking. So that can get a little tricky and a lot more difficult. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that we really understand what we're talking about as we move into the conversation about human trafficking. We have that definition really clear. The next thing that I want to define for us are push and pull factors. So this is something that you're going to hear a lot if you work in this sector. And a push factor is something that's simply true about the victim. It's something about them that makes them more vulnerable to being trafficked. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't mean that if you check these boxes, you're going to get trafficked. It just means as we look at the data of survivors, these things tend to be really common things that come up. In particular, a history of childhood sexual abuse. Up over 80% of sex trafficking victims report that they have a history of child sexual abuse. Then you have things like runaways. The LGBT community is more vulnerable. And then we're at the topic of gender. So we're going to be zeroing in on that push factor about gender today and how that influences trafficking, and in particular, the sex trafficking of children. Pull factors, on the other hand, are things that are true about the victim's environment. So where they come from. And obviously, if you're in a place where there's a lot of sex tourism, that's a vulnerability for some people. Being in the middle of a natural disaster, an earthquake or a tsunami or hurricane, or even where we are right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's an increased vulnerability. People lose their homes, they lose their families, they lose their jobs, they become more vulnerable to trafficking. So we're going to kind of be zeroing in on the topic of patriarchy and sexism, and that's another factor. It's a pull factor that pulls people into the industry. So let's get started on this one. I want to pull up some data first of all. I think it's really helpful to kind of look at where are we situated in this conversation when we're talking about gender. So this is some data that came out a while back, 4 or 5 years ago, by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And they just basically looked globally and said, okay, how many women and men, how many boys and girls are involved in trafficking? And this is trafficking as a whole: labor trafficking, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, the whole shebang. And what came out was around 70% of victims are female, and the other 30 are male. If we take that data and kind of pull it apart and say, let's look at the men, let's look at the women, it looks more like this. So most males, when they're trafficked into labor. So labor exploitation, these are the agricultural sector, the logging sector, construction industry, mining, things like that. You find a lot of people being forced as slaves, labor slaves, and that's predominantly male. On the other hand, about the same amount, 79% of females are trafficked into sexual exploitation. And there's actually a lot of overlap for these as well. So you'll find that a woman might be trafficked as a domestic servant, but in the context of that servitude, she's being sexually exploited as well. So sometimes it's not a real clean line between which one it is. It could be actually both, and that's pretty common. So as the sector has kind of grown over the last 2 decades, you know, if you've kind of been around and had your ear to the ground, you hear more and more and more talk about human trafficking, modern day slavery. And for a long time, those of us in the sector were working with this kind of data when we're talking about sex trafficking in particular. Well, 97% of the victims are female. And so for a long time, there was this perspective that sex trafficking was basically synonymous with a female problem, right? It was almost exclusively a female issue. And we're going to get into the argument today that maybe this particular data is old and it's not complete, and there's a lot more stuff coming out that kind of disproves this huge disparity between females and males. And my argument is it's really 2 sides of the same coin of patriarchy that's driving this skewed data. But what I want to say here is simply that for those of us in the sector, if I want to build a program, if I want to start a nonprofit, or if I want to advocate for the government to allocate resources for something specific, I have to argue from the data. I have to bring up the data and say, hey, this is why my program matters. This is why this organization should be doing this. This is why we should be getting these resources. And so because the data has said for so long, oh, it's mostly women or it's a female issue, if you start looking around, you'll find that the vast majority of resources in sex trafficking in particular are actually pointed toward females. All you have to do is Google search organizations, particularly in aftercare, and you'll find a lot of them, the vast majority of them are focused on females. And that totally makes sense because that's what our data said. But I want to say that this is just not quite the full picture. Now, before we go on and we've talked a little bit about the gender ratios and trafficking, but I want to make sure we're also defining patriarchy. So I'm going to throw out the word quite a bit, and I want to just make sure that we have the same definitions. So when we're talking about patriarchy, this could be a conversation that we spend hours and hours and days and weeks on. It's a huge topic. But for our purposes today, we're just talking about a system in which males are in charge, and the values and the priority are on men themselves. And so you have men up here and women are down here. But what you also find in patriarchy, whether we're talking a family or we're talking about a religious community or we're talking about an entire society or a nation, that it has patriarchal narratives. It's not even just men, women. You also have this pecking order of men. You have the men in charge, and then the men that are underneath them, and then the women as well. And patriarchy is this idea that because you have this kind of the cream of the crop men up at the top, they actually get to dictate what can and should happen to the people underneath them, in particular women. They're in charge of the women's bodies, and they say what can and can't happen and who isn't allowed access. And so it's just that the idea of men being able to be in control of that. And so that's patriarchy. It comes out in 1,000 different flavors, but that's kind of like the real basic definition of patriarchy and how we're going to understand it today. And we'll get into some of the kind of nuances in different places and how it's played out. So I want to talk a little bit about boys and girls. We'll start with girls and then move into boys and kind of talk about how patriarchal narratives really influence their experiences as children involved in the sex trade, and how it's kind of messed with our data, and then what we can do about that. So to start with, I want to introduce a really important study. It's by an organization called ECAT, which is in child prostitution and trafficking. They're a huge organization across the world, do a lot of research, and they did this study called Traffickers on the Move about 4 years ago, and it kind of blew everybody's narratives. They spent a lot of money on it and researched all over the world, and particularly about children involved in sex tourism. So that's kind of their niche. And what they learned was really huge. And I thought it was super fascinating that as they discussed girls and as they discussed boys, they kept pointing back to these patriarchal structures. So this is one of the quotes from that big research study. And it says that it's often the patriarchal structures entrenched in the slaves' countries of origin that feed the demand-supply model. They create and perpetuate economic and social inequalities, which paradoxically lead to an increased demand for women's sexual services and marriage. And so the idea is simply this, that when a society views women on some level as property, or views the value of girls as less than boys, it causes problems, and it ends up being one of those pull factors into trafficking, particularly for girls. And so let's look at some of the ways that that plays out. So these are some things that we see that are kind of really girl specific. We can talk about child marriage. That's what it sounds like. This is about kids getting married before they're adults. And this is very often a female child, so an underage girl, being married off to an adult man. And that's how it commonly plays out. And if you just kind of think about it to its logical conclusion, this is a type of sexual slavery. It's a type of forced labor. Often in these contexts, the girl is essentially owned by her husband and his family. And often it leads to other forms of trafficking as well. Certainly that's true in Indonesia, where the vast majority of the teenage sex trafficking victims that we find are girls that were involved in an underage marriage initially, and eventually ended up in brothels. So I do want to say, I think a lot of times there's this misperception that child marriage is limited to like certain regions of the world, and it just happens over there, certainly not in the West or in industrialized countries. That's not true. If you can tell by my accent, I'm an American. And in the United States, most of our states don't have a strict minimum age law for marriage. So some of them have no age restriction at all. Some states have like 12 or 13, as long as somebody signs off on it. And so there's some really cool movements right now trying to point out like, hey, there are actually children being married off in the US, and it's usually in the context of covering up for abuse. It's usually in the context of some sort of isolated community. And so, yeah, that's happening everywhere, not just over there. Another thing that's pretty exclusively female is bride trafficking. And this is different from child marriage. Bride trafficking could be minors, but it could be adults. And this one's often related to the topic of gendercide. So gendercide is basically the intentional genocide of females. And these are related to some patriarchal structures that are really specific. So if you're familiar with China's one-child law, they just abolished it recently. But for about a generation in China, families, for the most part, were only allowed one child. And because in that culture, there was the preference for boys. If I only have an option for a kid, I'd prefer a boy because wealth gets passed through the boy's family. The boy will take care of you when you're old. And so what this meant was, for many Chinese families, when they found out that they were having a girl child, the girl would be aborted. So there would be gender selected abortions, or later on, if a girl was born, there would be practices of infanticide. And obviously that's not everybody, but it happened enough that over time, over, you know, several decades, there became this messed up ratio where you had about 1 million more boys born than girls born in that time, or that many more boys kept alive. And so fast forward, all those boys have grown up and they need to get married, but there aren't enough girls to go around because the ratio is so disproportionate. And so now, right now in China, there's a lot of trafficking coming from Thailand, from Myanmar, from the surrounding countries, of women coming in to be married off to these men. And oftentimes they're coming in through fraud. They're being told, oh, come in for a job or whatever. And then they get there and they find themselves stuck and then married off into this Chinese family. So that's something that's happening, obviously exclusively to women. And then there's something similar in India that's happened. For many families in India, they practice the dowry system, which is basically when a girl gets married, she takes a portion of her family's wealth into her new husband's family. And so for these communities in India, it means when a girl is born, families like, oh, shoot, she's going to take wealth from us. But when a boy is born, there's a celebration. Oh yeah, he's going to bring wealth into the family. And the same thing ended up happening, where there's all these gender selected abortions, the practices of infanticide, and then you have the disproportionate ratio of men to women, and the need to find women for brides, and thus trafficking. And so those are very common, kind of really specific patriarchal communities or societal norms that have led directly into trafficking. And I put this common sex trafficking narrative in my work in Indonesia. I've had the opportunity to sit in a number of red light districts, especially in Bali, and just be with women who were being trafficked then, and a lot of them were minors. And the narratives that we saw the most, like I mentioned, were girls that were married off at like 13 or 14, and then a year or two later, her husband takes off, and now she has a baby, and she needs to take care of her family. She needs to take care of her child, and culturally, she has an obligation to take care of her parents, and so she becomes vulnerable. And at that point, a recruiter comes in and promises her economic opportunity. For example, hey, if you come to Bali, there's this great hotel and you can work there and you'll make so much money, you'll be able to send it home to your family and take care of them like you're supposed to. And you know what, I'll even arrange for you to get on the ferry, and I'll give you a cell phone so you can call your family back home. And so she's like, she thinks about it and she says, this seems like a good opportunity. She says, okay. She signs the contract, she gets on the boat, and she arrives. And when she gets to Bali, she gets taken to a brothel. And if she says, I don't want to do this, they say, well, you've signed this contract, your name's right here, and you owe us money for that phone we just gave you and for your ferry ticket. So you have to work for us at least until you've paid off your debt. And if she says, no, I don't want to do this, they remind her, we know where your child is, we know where your mom lives, and we'll hurt them if you don't comply. And so now she has the threat of force against her as well. And at that point, generally acquiesces, and then they can always step up the violence if they need to, and they do. So that's a pretty common trafficking narrative in Indonesia, and you'll see a lot of similar forms of that in other places as well. And so you have this minor who's now being trafficked. But then you have this virginity thing. And if you've paid attention a lot to conversations about patriarchy in modern day, there's a lot of conversations about the idea of purity culture. So the idea that a girl's value is based on her honor and her purity, her sexual purity. And so the idea that she is a virgin, that's way more important. She's way more marriable. She's way more honorable. She's good because she's a virgin, or she's only had sex in the appropriate context. And so if you can think about that, and for some places, it's an even bigger deal. In Indonesia, it's a very explicit cultural value, to the point that in Indonesia, if you want to become a police officer or work in the military as a female, you actually have to undergo government mandated virginity tests, which is kind of crazy to me. And so there's this huge, very explicit cultural value on a girl's purity, sexual purity. And what we find with a lot of survivors there is that keeps them trapped. And I remember sitting in a brothel with one gal I'd gotten close to over time, and She was probably about 18 or 19 at that point, and she had managed to pay off that debt, that original debt that she had. And she was thinking about going home, and I was talking to her about it, and I said, so have you made a decision? Are you going to leave the brothel? And she said, no, I think I'm going to stay. And I said, really? Why are you going to stay? And she said, well, you know, I have a daughter, and I just know, you know, she's 3 right now, but in another, you know, 10 or 12 years, if I don't stay and make a life for her by sending her money, then she'll end up right here where I am. And it's too late for me. There's nothing that can be done. I'm used up. And it broke my heart. On one hand, I understood it as a mother myself, the desire to protect my own kid and the willingness to sacrifice myself totally made sense. But on the other hand, she was expressing this perspective of, I'm used up, I'm no good anymore. I have so much shame. Specifically, I'm dirty, that I'm not even wantable anymore in my community. And that can get really, really messy and really trap people in it. But then you find the other side of that coin. Because virginity is so prized, you also find that the younger, the virginal, or have a higher monetary value in the sex trafficking industry. And that's a super gross thing to say. I recognize that. But being really honest and practical about it, traffickers know this is a more valuable product, so to speak. And so girls are trafficked specifically because they're virgins and they can get a higher price. And there's a few things that feed that. I think one is just the simple idea that girls are more valuable as virgins, but there are other things that happen around the world, not just in Indonesia, but this fetishizing of virginity and the belief that having sex with a child virgin actually can cure disease, particularly HIV, and you can follow that train where it goes, and it's horrible. And so you have people that might not even necessarily be like pedophiles or interested in sex with a child, except for the fact that they're sick and they're desperate to get well, and they've heard this myth that having sex with a virgin child will cure you of disease, and they're willing to do that. And so girls can really get a very high price in the industry. And what's really sad, something that some of the human rights activists, I learned this from them in Indonesia, that traffickers have found a way to pretend that girls are virgins. And I've heard, not in Indonesia, but in other countries, of even surgeries happening in Indonesia. There's a plant that can be basically crushed down, applied to the girl's genitals, and it irritates it and makes everything swollen, so that when she's violated again, she bleeds again. And so her virginity can be sold and resold. And I know a few victims for whom that's exactly the case. And so this fetishizing of virginity, very particular to females, and it's just fed by patriarchy's narratives about girls. But I think that that's a really incomplete picture if we're looking at trafficking as a whole. When we talk about patriarchy and we're talking about sex and sexual violence in particular, there's kind of the only place for girls or females is as victims. So sexual violence, females are the victims in that narrative in patriarchy. And males get 2 roles. If they're the good guys, they get to be the heroes. If they're the bad guys, they are the perpetrators. And so that's really all we have for men and women in terms of sexual violence. Females are victims, males are perpetrators or heroes. And the problem is it doesn't play out in real life. So we have to contend with data like this. So again, this was from the UN and some of their study on perpetrators themselves. And what they found in the study that they did was that a full third of the perpetrators in sex trafficking in particular, so these are the pimps, the brothel owners, the recruiters, that about a third of them are actually women. And that doesn't surprise me at all. In my own experience working in the red light districts, I mean, honestly, I probably saw at least as many women as men involved in the brothels. There's a whole staff around that business. And then again, you have kind of these chains of traffickers, and oftentimes women are used as recruiters because it's just easier for a woman to access a female than it is for a male oftentimes, especially in particular cultural settings. Oftentimes these female perpetrators were victims themselves. I know a few personally who that was their chain of events. They started off as trafficking victims, and at some point realized that they could be victimized or they could become a perpetrator, and they went with option B and became a recruiter or a brothel owner themselves. But certainly that's not all of them. Not all female perpetrators are victims. Some of them are just opportunists, and they choose to work in that illicit business. But the problem is this set of data doesn't fit that patriarchal narrative, right? Like, what do we do with the female? That's the bad guy, right? And even that language itself, the bad guy, is gendered. And I do want to say, however, when we're talking about the purchasers of sex, so the purchasers of children that are being exploited, those are still predominantly male. That has held true consistently through the data, and that hasn't really changed. There are absolutely female pedophiles. There are absolutely female purchasers of sex with children, but the vast majority of them are still male. So we're talking about perpetrators. I'm talking particularly about traffickers in this situation. But then we have this other issue of, what do we do with the men? Are boys only heroes or perpetrators, or is there actually a place for them in that category of victims? So this is a really interesting chart to me. The bottom blue line on your screen, these are reported sex trafficking cases. And for a really long time, what we were seeing was this huge gap, right? 97% female, 3% male. And that's what was being reported by victim services. And you saw this huge gap. But over time, we're starting to see that close. We're starting to see more and more boys being reported. And I don't think that's because more and more boys are starting to be exploited. It's not that all of a sudden traffickers are starting to traffic males. No, that's not it at all. It's just that we're starting to notice them. And so I think, and I'll kind of bring out some of the data from that ECAT study I was talking about, but I think this newer data is actually kind of showing us that just like patriarchy's narratives of girls are leading and pulling girls into being trafficked, patriarchy's narratives about boys are keeping us from noticing them and keeping their trafficking hidden. So let's talk about that a little bit more. The global study that I mentioned, again, points back to the patriarchal structures of society that's preventing the reporting of trafficking. And so what was really interesting to me as I was reading through the study and kind of digesting it when it came out, and then started comparing it to what we were seeing on the ground, was that when you're talking about trafficking situations for females, the vast majority of trafficking that happens in a formal setting. So girls get trafficked into brothels, they get trafficked into cafes, karaoke bars. And so when that girl gets recovered, it's very, very clear to the victim services or social workers that this kid has been sex trafficked. She was in a place where that's what was being purchased. It's very, very clear. But boys, however, what's come out is that their trafficking looks a little bit different. They are way more often bought for sex in informal places. And so we're talking about beaches and parks and bus stops, places that you don't necessarily associate with sex trafficking or prostitution. And very often, that's not the only form of exploitation that they're being involved with. So what that looks like for a boy is you have maybe a gang of boys that are, street kids, they're begging, or maybe they're pickpocketing, or maybe they're selling trinkets, or maybe they're performing something nightly for tourists. And so you have this, this group of kids, but they always have a handler. And if you are ever in that situation where you see some of these kids, you can just sit back and watch, and you will pretty quickly be able to identify the adult that's in the shadows watching. But there's an adult handler. And so when you have a purchaser of sex who wants to purchase one of these boys, they will also identify that leader, that handler who is the trafficker, and go to them and make a deal. I want to buy this kid. Can I have him for a couple of hours? Money's exchanged. And that child goes with the rapist and is exploited that way. And so when these kids are recovered, when these boys are recovered and they're going through victim services and, everyone's checking their boxes of what's going on, they might be identified as a street kid. Maybe they're even identified as a sexual assault survivor. But that box that says sex trafficking doesn't get checked because we're not thinking about it in terms of sex trafficking. It clearly is. Going back to our definition, this is a kid that's being held for the purpose of prostitution and sexual exploitation. He is a sex trafficking survivor, but he doesn't get counted in our data. And I think A lot of that is just in our own learning as a sector, we've had to kind of open our eyes and see that trafficking isn't just brothels, right? That it can happen in other ways, and it's very, very diverse in the way that it looks. But I think that there are some other things that have played out as well. One, the boy's reporting himself might not want to do that, and we'll talk a little bit about why in a minute. But some of it's in our own biases as caregivers and victim services. Maybe I have a hard time seeing that kid that way because my own narrative says females are victims, right? It's like sex trafficking victims are female. And so it's almost like a confirmation bias. So when we're looking at boys, again, my argument is that boys are hidden in sex trafficking because of patriarchy's impact. And we have that inaccurate assessment of victims, like I already mentioned, and that's kind of a domino effect. So if I have boys that aren't showing up in the data because victim services aren't checking the box because for these different reasons we don't see them as victims, well, then we have this skewed data that says 97% female, 3% male. And then you have inadequate aftercare. So if I'm allocating resources and I've got to decide between boys and girls, what am I going to do? I'm probably going to go with the 97%. That just makes sense. And so what that means is over time, we have radically inadequate aftercare for boy victims. In fact, there was a Polaris Project, is a big organization out of the US. They do a lot of data gathering, both in the US and then globally. But they did a study in the United States, just kind of a survey for aftercare for boys versus girls. And they found that for every 150 beds that available for a girl, there was only one available for a boy. So huge disparity in what's available. And I'm actually really excited. I was talking to one of Dark Volley's partners recently, and they're getting ready to open up a new aftercare center on another island. And they're actually doing some feasibility studies and thinking about making it a primarily boy aftercare center. And I'm really excited about that just because as far as I know in the whole country, there's not an aftercare center for males. All the ones I know of are specifically for females. And so we are seeing this just huge difference between availability and aftercare. In some cases, you end up having unjust and uneven laws. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, nations have the right to define human trafficking however they want. They can take that Palermo Protocol and just pop and plug, or they can change it up a bit. And there are some places where being a sex trafficking victim is identified legally as being female. So in order to be sex trafficked, you also have to be female, and that's actually embedded within their law codes. And obviously that's really problematic because if you have a boy, or a man that does want to seek justice and prosecution of his traffickers, he literally can't legally where he's from because he cannot be recognized as a sex trafficking victim according to those laws. And then you have these stigmas of vulnerability, and this, I think is kind of a direct arch right from patriarchy. If we have a narrative where girls are weak and boys are strong, we're going to really, really struggle with labeling a boy as a victim. And I think this is not just in sex trafficking. There's lots of conversations about how this plays out in all sorts of sexual violence. Men struggle to report because of how they're stigmatized as victims. It's like being emasculated. It's okay for a girl to be a victim, but somehow it's not okay for a boy to be a victim. And so you carry the stigma of vulnerability. And if, I'm a boy, I'm a male, I might really not want to report. But also, what if I'm a parent, right? So if for a girl, I'm a parent of a girl who is a sex trafficking victim or she's sexually assaulted, in Indonesia, at least, I don't necessarily want to report that because now people will know her as dirty and violated. She could be ostracized. She might not be marryable anymore. But if I'm the parent of a boy, it's a whole other story. It's not about his dirty or clean view. It's not the purity culture thing. It's that he's thought of as less of a man than his peers. And then there can be the LGBT label. And this is one that just boggles my mind. When you have a girl that is violated, nobody sits and asks her what her sexual orientation is. Nobody's like, well, because she was violated by a man, does that mean she just likes girls now or, prefers men? And that just doesn't happen. But it is super, super, super common when you have a boy that is sexually abused by a man, his sexual identity comes in question, and people ask his orientation and is he gay? And that can be a huge thing. And in places where LGBT label is dangerous, physically dangerous, socially dangerous, it's even more costly. So there are definitely places around the world where being homosexual is illegal. There are places where it might not be technically illegal, but it's kind of socially illegal, if you will. Certainly in Indonesia, there's a huge stigma around the LGBT population. And in certain parts of Indonesia, you can be beaten for it or jailed for it, run out of town for it. And so if I'm a man that's been violated, you know, maybe I'm a 15-year-old boy and I've been trafficked, maybe I'm not going to say anything, in part because I don't want to be emasculated and thought of as weak. And in part because if I get labeled gay, my life is over and I might be run out of town and people are going to question me. It's going to follow me for the rest of my life. And as a parent, or even as a caregiver, that's got to go through my head. Do I really want to check that box saying that this kid was sexually assaulted or this boy was a sex trafficking survivor? Because I know what the community does, and they throw this label of he's gay on him because he was sodomized, and now he has so much more to pay for. And that can get really, really, really awful. So again, I want to say that I think that patriarchy is really kind of at the root of a lot of the struggles for both boys and girls. I think girls get trafficked and kind of identified as victims, targeted is the word I'm looking for, because they're female. But for the boys, they just stay hidden. We don't see them because they're boys. And so it's really two sides of the same really gross coin. And I appreciated this quote from that study, that girls have long been assumed to be the main targets for sexual predators, but research for this global study reveals that boys are strongly affected. The context that makes both boys and girls vulnerable is tied to social norms about gender. Essentially, it's the age-old stereotypes that girls are weak and passive and should remain in the home, while boys are strong and virile and capable of taking on the world. The gender myth that boys are invulnerable and can take care of themselves has meant that they're far less likely to report incidents of sexual exploitation and seek assistance. And so this same study, what kind of threw everybody for a loop as they surveyed across the globe in all of these different contexts and all of these different government and non-government groups, and kind of dived into the data, what they found was in most places, there were just as many boys being targeted for sex trafficking in the tourism industry as girls. And in some places, there actually, boys were the preferred victim group. And so I think we want to be aware, and as a sector, we have to start really looking at our boys and being honest about that data, and obviously continuing to address these issues that are targeting girls as well. So it's a yucky topic, and I think most people, when they have this discussion, immediately the question is just, well, what can we do? What do I do as somebody that's not a professional in the sector, but somebody that cares about this? I care about kids. I care about kids being exploited, and I want to be a part of the solution. And I think the good news is that really everybody has a role to play, and there is literally something that every single person can do to help minimize the trafficking and to restore its survivors. So my advice when I get asked this question is always think locally and internationally. Most cities have some sort of response. There's lots of task forces in different places. There's groups that are involved. And if you don't have something that's directly trafficking focused, even being involved in things like foster care or supporting people involved in foster care, and kind of looking at those push factors and looking at those groups, or even the pull factors, and saying, what can I do about some of these factors that really speak to me to help mitigate that? I also encourage people to look internationally. If you are able to view this webinar, it means you have access to the internet and some sort of electronic device, which means you have more money than the vast majority of people in the world. And so I always say, look, if you have means, then we have a social responsibility to take care of and care for people that don't. And so I always encourage people to look internationally at regions of the world that don't have much in the way of resources. So you can look at our website, darkbali.org, to learn more about some of these things. On our ACT page, we've been really deliberate about trying to help people have some ideas for resources. So there's, you know, how to spot trafficking, how to, if you're a traveler, to stay in a hotel that's signed a requirement for reporting and saying that they will. So how do I find those kind of hotels? What do I do with kids that are begging on the street? All sorts of things like that. We also have a prayer guide if you're a person of faith that's specific about kids and trafficking. Obviously, report. There are national hotlines in most countries, texting and calling. So if you see something weird, report it. You don't need to investigate it. There are investigators that do that, but definitely report. And then I always say, find an organization you think is amazing and be their biggest advocate. For organizations like Dark Volley that are NGOs and relying on donations, we need people that see us and help other people see us. So if you find an organization you love, you know, blast them on your social media, tell them about your friends, and then think about volunteering. And a lot of people, when they think volunteering and anti-trafficking, they're like, well, I'm not a counselor, you know, I'm not a social worker. But actually, we need a lot of skills like bookkeeping and website maintenance, social media managers, things like that are actually really, really, really helpful. So think through kind of what your skills and your resources are and find an organization that you really match with and offer that up. And then finally, I would say to be an ethical consumer, especially when we're talking about things like labor trafficking. Our demand for cheap products means there's some smart trafficker that can eliminate the cost of production by not paying somebody at all or fairly. And so I want to think through, does my desire for a cheap t-shirt, is that worth the knowledge that somebody down the road, and probably the person that made it, isn't being paid fairly? And so learning about the product lines of the things that I consume is really important. And I think Australia in particular has done a really good job of producing like a lot of like consumer guides in different sectors, be it coffee or chocolate or clothing or whatever. So start thinking through the way that you consume things. So all of these are helpful. All of these things are meaningful and something that anybody can do, whether or not you're involved in anti-trafficking as a professional. So I want to give you guys a chance. If you did have any questions, now is the time to throw those in the chat box as we finish up here. I do want to say I love getting questions or comments or conversations through email. You can email me at delana@darkvolley.org if you want to take it offline. That's totally fine. And this will be up online in the next few days. I'll put it up there if you want to review it or send it to somebody. Feel free to do that. Find out more about us on darkvolley.org. Again, there's a lot of stuff that's put out there specifically for the non-professional community to learn about trafficking, to figure out what their role is in preventing it and being involved. And then also, of course, you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram. We try to, again, communicate things that are happening, important new data that's coming out, interesting articles about trafficking. So if you want to just stay educated, we try to make that a big part of our social media as well. If we have more webinars, we will put those up and put announcements on social media. So that's what I have for you guys today. Again, thank you so much for coming and just giving us a little bit of your weekend and learning more about this. To me, it just speaks to the fact that you care, and that means a lot to me. So have a great weekend and stay safe and make sure to wash your hands. And thank you guys for coming. Have a great day.